One of the things I always wanted from being a kid is a garden railway. Nikki's also really into gardening, and so we wanted to put our kind of hobbies together. So in
Model railways may not be everyone's cup of tea, but for Curtis, his passion for trains has developed over time, which has since led to the creation of the HSBA Garden Railway. Not only did we get a chance to see the model, but we also got a rundown of how it came to be and what the inspiration was behind it. Thanks for joining me, Curtis. We'd love to hear more about your amazing project. So, can you tell me a little bit more about the model that you have in your garden?
So in our back garden, we have about 138 metres of track with trains that can run around. The track, just to give you kind of a mental model or a visual of this, is 45 millimetres between the rails, so they're quite chunky. So a lot of you will probably think about model trains as being a bit smaller, the kind of things you get from Hornby. These are made by German companies, and we call this G scale. So 45 millimetres between the rail, and yeah, they can get quite heavy. Two operating lines, one on the top and then one below. We have 4 or 5 bridges, 2 tunnels, and lots of interest as they meander around the garden, around the pond and between the plants.
So what is it about trains that have got you creating a whole model in your garden? Was it a childhood interest, or is this something that you picked up a little bit later on in life?
Definitely was always into trains as a kid. And I had actually a much smaller version of the garden railway when I was a kid. So it was my parents got me a starter set when I was probably 7 or 8, and a starter set is when you get like a looper track, a locomotive and 2 carriages and a power controller so you can play with them, and then the kind of the hobby and the interest kind of grew from there. Then you kind of hit your teenagers where it's not cool to play with trains, and so the interest kind of died down a little bit, and then life gets in the way in your 20s. And then actually a few years ago when Nikki and I were living in Berlin, I told her that as a kid we used to put a train around the Christmas tree, and she was like, well, why don't you do that again? So I was like, okay. So I bought another starter set in Germany, and that really just unleashed the passion again. And I think Germany's a great place. So a lot of these models are made in Germany. It means the German eBay is a really good second-hand market. So some of it can get expensive, but if you're paying attention to eBay, you can normally get good deals. And so essentially it grew out from there. We knew that we were going to be moving to Jersey, and as part of that I said I just really wanted to rekindle that kind of permanent garden railway. Nikki was super enthusiastic and super supportive of it. So yeah, it was one of those hobbies, childhood hobby, rekindled as an adult when you have kind of the time and ability to realise that dream, I guess.
Can you tell me how long you've been building this model for?
So I think we were doing renovation of the house since August last year, and the garden started probably around September, October time. A lot of the groundworks and walls and stuff were done by our builders, because I do not have any of the capabilities to do that. I think it would have been very slow and not great quality. So probably about that time last year. It's not constant, so I'm not going to say it's took us several months, because obviously there's lots of things that depend when you're building a garden railway, dependent on your time with like work and stuff, but also the weather can be very unforgiving. I was lucky actually over the Christmas period, the weather was actually quite dry, so I spent probably, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 days over Christmas pretty much constantly in the garden while it was dry. Heavy soil to work with, but we got a lot of the basics out there. And then over the last few weeks I think we've picked up pace again, because we've had a few weeks of nice weather. And so yeah, hard to give a complete time. It's been in progress, I think, since September, October last year. But yeah, probably several days or probably a couple of weeks worth of work total.
Just mentioning the weather there, do you think that's been your biggest challenge so far building your model?
That's a really good question. It can be. It's actually a great question. It can be, right? And it can be. So I think with any hobby, you go through ebbs and flows of when you want to spend time on it, right? You've had a tough week at work. Sometimes you just want to sit and watch Netflix or walk the dog or go for a meal, right? There's other things you want to do with your time. It's not that your hobby becomes 100% of your non-work time. And sometimes you just had a tough week at work and you're not really in the mood to go and do something in this hobby, or you go and work on something else. Instead of like wanting to lay track, I actually want to do some programming with the locomotives to do different sounds and etc. So I think weather is definitely a constraint, because then sometimes you're really in the mood to do something and it's Jersey, so you can get very windy and get very rainy and you're like, no, I'd rather be outside. So I think the weather is probably one of the more, it's the external factor that can limit how much time you can spend on that. And then I think the other time, sometimes it's just planning, right? You know, do you have the pieces of track that you need to do what you want? I had to make a recent order of more track, and I had to get it from the Netherlands, so you have to wait for it to ship from the Netherlands, and you know, pay the postage, which is not always cheap because it's made of brass, so it can be quite heavy. So there's other things like that, but generally I say the weather is probably the biggest external factor, and then internally it's just as life gets in the way or doesn't get in the way of when you want to spend some time on it.
Do you have any plans to expand your railway, or is this the final product?
I'll be honest, I don't think there's much place I can expand it in this current garden. I think Nikki and I designed it, and it's quite, you've been outside, you've seen it, it's quite a lot. But I think in terms of, if the general question is what are the next steps? So there's still a lot of building work we have to do in terms of making sure all the plants are in and the rockeries and all the track works really well. So the bottom loop is working, it works great, the trains run reliably. The upper loop is still in question, but the intention is to get to the point where you can set and forget. So you let them go off while you're outside. You don't want to be constantly looking, because there's a little bit of track where the trains sometimes come off or stop. So I think there's a degree of reliability that's going to be really important for us. Eventually, there's other things we want to add in there, so like buildings and scenery and lights in those buildings, which add another kind of mission to what you had in terms of how you grow it and expand it. And then the other thing that's something that I've always wanted to do is automation, so computer control. So this idea that instead of having a train that just goes round and round, the computer knows where a particular train is at a given point, so it can come into a station, stop, and it will send another train off. So then you have this constant movement. It feels more realistic, is the wrong phrase, but it just gives a lot more dynamism to what's happening in the layout. So there's all these different things that I think are fun to work on. It's one of those hobbies that's never done. Even if the layout itself is done, there's always something else that you can be doing. And then on top of that, once we're obviously happy with the reliability and happy to kind of like share it with the world, we want to run open days in the summer to raise money for local charities.
And have any of your trains derailed at all?
Oh, it happens all the time. I think anyone that's had model trains or anything like this will know that, just because it's working perfectly one day, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. And anything, it can be a cat or a dog has walked across the layout. It could be someone that's caught the track and they've moved it. I mean, the other day, Nikki and I were planting some bamboo just kind of down by the side, and I lifted one of the plant pots across. I caught the track and I damaged one of the pieces of track, and obviously had to replace that. So yeah, I mean, it can be, there's a degree of maintenance that's somewhat interesting because it feels like you're kind of invested in it, but you don't want to do the thing where anytime you want to get the trains out, you feel like you have to spend 15 minutes, an hour trying to make sure everything's running fine. So yeah, there are maintenance problems, there are challenges, but I think at the moment it's just about understanding what causes them and trying to minimise it, just like you would get on a real railway.
Is there a backstory to your name HSBA? What do the acronyms stand for?
Yeah, so there is a narrow gauge railway in Germany called the HSB. Very famous narrow gauge railway. Still actually runs steam locomotives, which is not so common. Now, I always like to make personal connections with stuff that I do, and so all of the main stations are named after a Germanized version of friends and family members. So one of the main stations is called Steinertal, which is essentially a Germanized version of Stanier, meaning basically Stanier Valley. For one, it's a very loose translation or a very loose Germanization. And it just so happens that kind of if I look at my Nikki's surname and then like my parents and stuff like that you can get to HSB, and then with Nikki's maiden name was the A. So I was like, oh, HSBA. So that's where the main stations came from. That's where the acronym came from. again, and it's a bit of Nikki and I visited the HSB. It's in the Harz Valley. We visited it a couple of years ago when we were living in Germany. It's just beautiful. We rode the trains, but the whole nature around it is amazing. So yeah, that's essentially where the name came from. And then the bridges and tunnels and the waterfall all have their own names and nods to our friends and family. One of the things that actually, going back to the expansion, one of the things that we're going to build is a ruined castle. Now, a few years ago, one of my best friends passed away, unfortunately, but his surname was Svart, so meaning black. We're also a fan of Game of Thrones, so this ruined castle is going to be Schloss meaning castle black. So a bit of a double nod, and there's like these little bits of like internal trivia or things. I think it's just fun because it just gives the whole thing a bit of personality. At least for Nikki and I, it does.
So I've done some research and I've seen on your blog and your Instagram that you've customised a few pieces. In particular, I noticed the milk tanker was a Jersey Dairy one. Was this a choice that you made to localise the trains, or is there another hidden meaning behind it?
Yeah, not all of them. So again, I think it's about these little nods that we can do to certain things. So I think one of the Jersey Dairy's on there. There's one that's for Home Farm, which is my parents' dairy farm in St John, and then there's a HelloFresh one. I worked for HelloFresh 3 years, and it was a great company to work for. So I think again, just adding these little bits of personality to the layouts and the models are good. Don't do it for all of them. I normally do it with wagons that I can get secondhand quite cheaply because obviously there is a degree of resale value. Not that I intend to necessarily sell it, but as your collection grows, there's some things you might want to get rid of to fund like a different style, a different theme. So not doing it with everything, but I think anything you can do to do these little nods. There's a few that I have in mind that I would still like to do. I'm a big fan of Wildfire. So Wildfire is probably going to get like a cattle wagon or something like that. Is like a funny nod to it. And then I also want to do something for Durrell. So just again, just these little things that we can do that like personalize the layout for us. Doesn't have to be everything, but this is little nods.
Earlier into our conversation, you mentioned that you're hoping to open up your garden in the future and host fundraisers. Was this something that you've had in mind for a while now? Yeah,
so I think it was always something that we discussed about building when we did it here. It's not necessarily something I've dreamed of as a child. But I think like with any hobby, or with most hobbies, maybe any hobby is a bit too encompassing. It's nice to show off the things that you're passionate about, right? And not in a kind of in your face kind of way, but giving the chance for other people to come and share it. I mean, the Instagram really picked up. I think it's got at the moment about 4,500 followers, and a bunch of people, some complete train nerds that just want to talk about the trains, and they go into a load of detail with me, like on Messenger, and some people are like, this is cool, not something I've done. And so I think just being able to share that is really nice. I would probably have always done open days at some point, but I think the idea of raising money for local charities is just, if it's something we can do, I don't see why not. We would probably rotate around different charities, and I think the way Nikki and I thought about it was we'd both, for each open day, we'd each pick one and then split the kind of donations between them. The other thing I'm just very conscious of as well is when I was younger, there was a gentleman that lived not far from where I lived as a kid. And his entire garden, like you think this is a lot. This guy's entire garden was Garden Railway, and he invited. I rang up and he invited me and my mum. And I was about probably 10 or 11 at this point. He invited me and my mum round, and he kind of showed us the whole garden and was super helpful to answer questions. And I think there's actually a really great community around garden railways, model railways, generally speaking, and it's just the ability to show other people, like what can you do, and share it with them and give other people a hand if they want to get into the hobby. I think it's really great. Just to know, on Jersey, there is the Jersey Model Railway Club, which is wonderful. They meet up in Trinity, so if anyone's interested, they have a website. And then on garden railways specifically, if something you're interested in, obviously, you can follow on our Instagram. And then there's also the G-Scale Society, which is a UK-based collection of humans that are into the larger model railways, generally outside, but also inside. So I just wanted to share with those, because I think if it's something you're interested in, it's just being part of the bigger community.
And finally, I have to ask, out of all the models that you've seen and purchased, do you have a favourite train?
So that's a really interesting. Yes, but I have a few, and for different reasons. So I have one that Nikki bought me, I was really stressed at work, and it was coming up to my birthday, and it was a present from Nikki as always, like, come on, you can get over this challenge, which is great. And that's one of my favourites. It's a beautiful locomotive, and it means a lot because Nikki bought it for me. And then I have a locomotive that I want to be my favourite, but it's a really unreliable runner for various reasons. And so it's the one that I said I want it to be my favourite. It looks fantastic, but it never works properly when you put it on the track. And so I've got to sit down and do a bunch of maintenance on it. And then I've got another one that is beautiful and is just an incredible runner that, like, normally if I wanted to get something up and running quickly, I put that one on. So yeah, it's weird, and it sounds a bit odd to say that they have personalities, because I wouldn't quite go that far. But there's definitely the one that you're like, oh, you annoy me sometimes, or the other one that, like, oh, this looks really great. So yeah, probably wouldn't say it's a full personality, but there's definitely, you have your own mental models or perspectives over certain locomotives.
And if you'd like to find out more on future events with Curtis, you can visit him on Instagram at HSBA Garden Railway. Don't forget to like and share. And thanks very much for listening.